Iran's recent developments have been truly gripping, with many debating whether the nation is on the brink of major upheaval, some even suggesting it's on its last legs. Especially after the U.S. high-profile intervention in Venezuela and the removal of Maduro. More observers are speculating whether Iran might become the next prime target. Those familiar with Iran know this nation seems perpetually embroiled in mass demonstrations. Each time protests surge, whispers of regime change echo relentlessly. Yet remarkably, Iran consistently navigates these crises, emerging resiliently each time. This raises the question: will Iran truly undergo a regime change? What form of governance does it truly require? Is secularization the only viable path? Today, we delve into why Iran, from historical to contemporary times, has consistently relied on charismatic leaders. The current wave of Iranian protests has escalated into an intensely confrontational phase. Unlike Trump's straightforward handling of the Maduro situation, Iran's turmoil has dragged on, with fragmented information circulating widely. Compounded by factions with differing agendas releasing biased reports, the entire situation appears intricately complex. To untangle this, we can divide the process into 4 phases: the ignition of discontent, the spread of protests, the escalation of confrontation, and the stalemate, each containing pivotal moments that shaped the trajectory and laid groundwork for subsequent developments. First, consider the initial stage. The ignition of discontent stemmed from immediate livelihood struggles rather than immediate political slogans. Since 2024, Iran has faced multiple crises. Severe inflation caused currency devaluation, while energy shortages became routine. Frequent power and gas outages severely disrupted daily life. Internationally, Iran's long-standing support for foreign armed groups and its repeated setbacks in confronting Israel fueled growing domestic skepticism about the value of investing resources in such endeavors. Compounding these issues, worsening water scarcity and rising taxes added pressure, causing discontent to simmer beneath the surface. In early December 2025, the government raised gasoline subsidies nationwide, triggering inflation fears and sending the Iranian rial plummeting. At its worst, $1 traded for 1.42 million rials, a scene reminiscent of the chaos when the Kuomintang's gold certificates drastically devalued. Finally, on December 28, 2025, protests erupted first in 2 major markets in central Tehran. Merchants in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran closed their shops and took to the streets, openly expressing their anger over the plummeting exchange rate and soaring prices. It bears special mention that while bazaar literally means market, its significance in Central and West Asian societies extends far beyond commerce. As an agrarian people, we may struggle to fully grasp that in ancient societies where scarcity prevailed, and daily necessities depended heavily on trade, merchants were far more than mere traders. They traveled far and wide, were well connected, and possessed relatively extensive knowledge, forming the true backbone of society. Bazaars served, to some extent, as a public square, a vital space for people to gather, exchange information, and build consensus. Merchants dread uncertainty most. Payments received today could drastically lose value tomorrow. Newly arrived goods might face losses overnight, or prices might shift before they could even calculate costs. Therefore, when bazaar merchants openly lost patience with the government and took to the streets to protest, this was no longer merely ordinary people venting frustrations online. It signaled that the most sensitive and core segment of the economic structure had begun to mobilize, marking the end of the first phase and the imminent transition to a new stage. Within a single day, the protests rapidly spread beyond the capital Tehran to multiple cities, escalating from localized incidents into a nationwide wave of demonstrations that even reached university campuses. The merchants' protests fundamentally stemmed from dissatisfaction with the collapse of economic order, while students often took it further, elevating specific livelihood issues to the political level for structured critique and reflection. When these two forces converged, the nature of the protests fundamentally shifted from purely economic demands to questioning and challenging the political system. At this juncture, Iran's democratically elected secular government faced the initial social pressure. To ease tensions, the central bank governor resigned first, while President Pezeshkian expressed willingness to engage in dialogue with the public, convene business forums, and urge security forces to exercise restraint to prevent escalation. Yet it must be recognized that Iran has endured years of sanctions, with its economy suppressed for decades. The government's policy toolkit lacks effective countermeasures. Replacing officials cannot resolve deep-seated economic structural issues, nor can market confidence be swiftly restored by mere statements. Against this backdrop, the government's measures appeared feeble, marking the end of the second phase as the situation began escalating toward confrontation. Entering the third phase, the intensity of confrontation has markedly escalated. First, Iranian authorities officially confirmed for the first time that at least 7 people have died in the protests, signifying that violent clashes have become public and the situation has grown more severe. Simultaneously, external forces have begun actively intervening. President Trump made high-profile statements on social media, declaring that the United States stands ready to intervene in Iran's affairs. Overseas opposition figures, represented by leaders from the Pahlavi era, seized the opportunity to call for the overthrow of the current Iranian government and the establishment of a transitional regime. To control the situation, the Iranian government implemented harsh measures on January 8, including cutting off internet access and international long-distance calls. Unofficial reports indicate that approximately 30,000 to 40,000 Starlink terminals were smuggled into Iran prior to the outbreak of these large-scale protests. However, Iran had prepared in advance, having previously acquired Starlink jamming technology through special channels and purchased related jamming equipment. The internet shutdown produced 3 major consequences. First, it significantly hindered protest organizers' ability to disseminate information and coordinate actions. Modern state governance relies not only on military force but increasingly on information control and transactional systems. One core demand of the protesters was precisely to seize control of information channels. The shutdown elevated the information warfare between the two sides to a new level. Second, the shutdown severely disrupted normal societal functions. Payment systems, healthcare services, banking operations, logistics, and daily business activities all suffered significant impacts. This tangible inconvenience extended to citizens not initially involved in protests, inadvertently broadening the protest movement's grassroots support base. Third, the information vacuum in the international arena fuels speculation, with unseen circumstances often interpreted as more brutal suppression. This has placed Iran in a more passive position in the global discourse. At this juncture, the protesters' demands have fundamentally shifted, with many explicitly calling for the overthrow of the Islamic theocratic regime. This signaled that the conflict had escalated beyond mere internal social tensions into a confrontation between differing state capabilities. On January 9, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei finally made a public appearance, attributing all current social unrest to U.S. interference and labeling protesters as those seeking to please the U.S. president and expecting Trump's assistance. Subsequently, the Justice Minister issued a hardline statement, vowing to impose decisive, severe, and legally uncompromising punishments on demonstrators. Immediately after, the Revolutionary Guard formally entered the fray, emphasizing that security is an untouchable red line. The military also explicitly pledged to protect public property. State media broadcast footage of funerals for security personnel, shifting the narrative entirely toward maintaining order and opposing violence. However, the IRGC's intervention further provoked bazaar merchants. The underlying reason is straightforward. The IRGC engages in military business ventures, operating across multiple economic sectors and steadily squeezing the traditional merchant class's livelihood space. The long-standing animosity between the two groups has deepened. The IRGC's involvement has made the already complex situation even more delicate, propelling the events into their current fourth phase of stalemate. Today, protests and official crackdowns have spread to nearly every major city in Iran. Neither side can provide accurate figures on the number of deaths or arrests during the demonstrations. In truth, during such an era of profound transformation, no country in the world can claim absolute security. We may well see similar unrest emerge in more small nations in the future. Amid Iran's nationwide internet blackout and heightened confrontational environment, fixating on precise casualty and arrest figures holds little practical value. Our goal isn't statistical precision but to discern the trajectory and scale of developments through fragmented information. Equally critical is recognizing that this crisis is accompanied by an intense battle of narratives and perceptions, with all sides vying for control over the story. Iran's official narrative centers on restoring social order and countering foreign interference, using the commemoration of fallen security personnel to build domestic consensus. The U.S. repeatedly emphasizes Iranian government suppression of its people, amplifying humanitarian crises to justify potential future intervention. Meanwhile, Iran's traditional ally Russia has publicly opposed foreign interference in Iran's internal affairs while reaffirming its commitment to continued cooperation. Within China's domestic discourse, various voices are using the Iran issue to articulate their own positions and perspectives. Some individuals, who generally align with Western systems and harbor misunderstandings or even opposition toward China's political structure, hope for the Iranian regime's collapse and the establishment of a pro-American government. They may even anticipate this new administration turning against China, thereby amplifying the narrative that China is isolated and friendless. Others, who support China's system and recognize the progressiveness of socialism, are inherently skeptical of religious governments and thus also wish for the current Iranian regime to fall. Upon closer examination, these debates essentially represent a contest of narratives between differing stances. Yet we must clearly recognize that the decisive factors in whether a system collapses are not ideological disputes, but rather the actual functioning of its political structure, the support of its violent apparatus, and the capacity of its state finances. Moreover, the collapse of a regime does not guarantee the emergence of a more advanced or rational ideology or political system. For Iran, regardless of whether the current theocratic system persists, it requires a strongman regime, a necessity dictated by both its historical and geographical conditions. Many may imagine national development as painting on a blank canvas, freely sketching any blueprint, yet reality differs. For a nation and its people, the shape and texture of this paper are fundamentally shaped by geopolitical and geographical constraints. Every artist must work within the confines of this predefined canvas. Their creations collectively form the nation's history. In modern times, all leaders can only attempt to add their own strokes upon the existing shape and pre-drawn patterns of this paper. The type of brushes you can obtain, the number of brushes you can hold at once, and the number of strokes you can make, whether you can paint freely or must adhere to predetermined rulers and markings, these constitute a nation's national conditions and institutional framework. Therefore, we should not assume that supreme leaders or similar figures can act with complete freedom. In reality, they are merely navigating various objective constraints, seeking one or two viable paths forward, and striving. To understand why Iran needs strong leadership, one must first grasp the fundamental nature of this paper geopolitically. Iran is surrounded by Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, bordered by the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south. The world's largest oil and gas belt spans Siberia, the Caspian Sea, and the Persian Gulf, holding 2/3 of global reserves. With Iran at its very heart, Iran's primary terrain is the Iranian plateau, flanked by the Zagros Mountains to the southwest and the Alborz Mountains to the north. These mountain ranges form natural barriers that have historically made it difficult for foreign conquerors to completely subjugate Iran. However, this topography also contributes to the relative scarcity of Iran's geographical resources. Before oil became the lifeblood of national economies, a region's development primarily depended on three core geographical resources: water, arable or pasture land, and trade routes and passes. These three resources directly determine how many people a region can support, how much tax revenue it can collect, the size of army it can field, and whether it can develop a stable network of cities. In other words, they define the lower limit of a nation's capabilities. Iran, however, exhibits significant shortcomings in all three areas. First is the scarcity of water resources. The aforementioned high mountains block the entry of moisture, resulting in extremely limited precipitation across Iran. The country's average annual rainfall is approximately 376 cubic kilometers. Yet 66% of this precipitation evaporates before reaching rivers. Consequently, the total annual renewable water resources amount to only about 137.5 cubic kilometers, with just 9 cubic kilometers originating from outside Iran. This results in vast stretches of arid and semi-arid land across central Iran, a sparse river network, and many major rivers originating outside the country. Iran's water resources resemble a rare gift from the heavens. One must strive desperately to catch it, and even when caught, it proves difficult to retain for long. Secondly, arable and grazing land is scarce. Iran does possess favorable regions, such as the narrow humid belt along the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, certain valleys in the Zagros Mountains, and the Khuzestan Plain. These areas support relatively stable agricultural production and settlement patterns. However, overall, Iran's areas suitable for stable cultivation are highly fragmented. Unlike the Mesopotamian or Nile River basins, or China's North China Plain, they cannot form large-scale, contiguous agricultural production zones. This severely limits both agricultural development and population carrying capacity. Finally, Iran is a classic corridor anxiety state. It occupies an exceptionally unique position within Eurasia's transportation network, functioning like a plateau connecting the Mesopotamian basin to Anatolia, the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea, Central Asia to the Indian Ocean, and the Persian Gulf to the interior regions, a veritable crossroads of commerce. Precisely because of this, external powers throughout history have sought to exert influence here, vying for control over this vital corridor. Yet Iran's terrain is far from flat. Mountains and deserts make its already limited viable routes even scarcer, elevating these transit points to immense strategic importance. Control over these passages and choke points has profoundly shaped Iran's political and military. Thus, for Iran, merely defending its borders is woefully inadequate. Its geography and geopolitical position inevitably make it a focal point of contention among various powers. Even if Iran chooses not to take the offensive, others will inevitably covet it. Moreover, its scarcity of natural resources means that unless it actively seeks external space and resources, it risks being besieged and suffocated. This reality has historically made it difficult for Iran to become a peaceful and stable nation. It must maintain a state of perpetual vigilance, always prepared to confront various internal and external challenges. Historically, Iran's most iconic power struggle was its protracted contest with the Ottoman Empire over the Mesopotamian region. After establishing its rule, the Ottoman Empire promoted Sunni Islam and suppressed Shiism. Shiite religious communities within the Ottoman Empire, along with former steppe mercenaries, were forced into exile in what is now Iran. There, they elevated a Shiite religious leader to establish the Safavid Empire. Among global Muslims, Shiism represents only about 10%, making it a minority sect. Among global Muslims, Shiism represents only about 10%, making it a minority sect. To unify ideology and consolidate power, the Safavid Empire implemented major reforms, establishing Shiism as the state religion. This transformation cemented Iran's status as the global center of Shia Islam, a position it has maintained to this day. Separating the Ottoman Empire and Iran lay Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. This land promised abundant water resources, grain production, a substantial population base, and tax revenues, while also serving as a crucial hub for trade routes, endowing it with immense strategic value. Consequently, Iran and the Ottoman Empire engaged in prolonged tug-of-war and warfare over Iraq, Baghdad, and the Caucasus region. This conflict, beginning in 1514, persisted until 1639 when Iran's defeat culminated in the Treaty of Zuhab. This treaty affirmed Ottoman dominance over Iraq and delineated the fundamental borders of modern Iran. From this point onward, Iran began its gradual decline. Yet the deeper its decline, the more it sought survival through warfare. Beyond continuing its confrontation with the Ottoman Empire, Iran also engaged in conflicts with neighboring India, Uzbekistan, and even the Russian Empire. Domestically, Iran's political landscape invariably shifted with the fortunes of war. Defeat against foreign enemies eroded the regime's legitimacy. Victory granted leaders immense prestige, sometimes enabling them to overthrow old regimes and establish their own monarchies. Iran's history largely unfolded according to this logic. For instance, the Safavid dynasty was ultimately overthrown by General Karim Khan after foreign military defeats, leading to the establishment of the Zand dynasty. The Zand dynasty was later replaced by the Kayar dynasty after military inferiority to the Kayar tribe. The Kayar dynasty, defeated in war against Russia, ceded the Caucasus region. During World War I, it became a pawn contested by Britain, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, ultimately overthrown by cavalry commander Reza Shah Pahlavi. This forced Iran to endure a harsh geopolitical curse. Without control of the Mesopotamian region, it could scarcely secure a stable, contiguous agricultural hinterland. Consequently, the nation's fiscal revenue and population capacity could only rely on a few key regions and trade hubs. This made Iran hypersensitive to its peripheral buffer zones and excessively wary of external threats. Over time, this mindset fostered Iran's enduring tradition of strongman politics. The nation's political aesthetic revolves around strongmen, with all interest groups coveting supreme power. Historically, no genuine retrenchment-oriented leader has ever emerged. To this day, Iran's resource and geopolitical disadvantages profoundly shape its social and political landscape. For instance, by November 2025, before the recent unrest erupted, Tehran's water crisis had already reached critical levels. Taps frequently ran dry, nighttime water pressure plummeted, and reservoir capacities dwindled to roughly half their capacity, with some reservoirs even lower. The president publicly warned that without significant rainfall, rationing might become necessary, and large-scale emergency plans were discussed. For Iran, water scarcity has long transcended environmental concerns, becoming a matter of national survival. To ensure food security and regime stability, Iran has long pursued agricultural and industrial expansion, which inevitably intensified water stress. Particularly after the Iranian Revolution, policies actively promoted water-intensive agriculture, resulting in agriculture consuming an exceptionally high proportion of the nation's total water usage. To ensure citizens can afford and access basic necessities, the state must maintain price stability through subsidies or administrative intervention. Yet greater subsidies intensify fiscal strain. Tighter finances necessitate securitizing social management, reinforcing controls to prevent instability. Understanding Iran's geography and historical context provides deeper insight into its current theocratic system and the Khomeini regime. Many envision Iran's power structure as a pyramid, the supreme leader at the apex, followed by the government, military, and citizens below. This suggests that toppling the supreme leader would collapse the entire system. Yet reality differs. Iran's power structure fundamentally operates as a coalition, like a shared cake divided among competing interest groups that both depend on and constrain each other. Iran's theocratic system does not mean religion directly controls everything. Instead, nearly every critical domain operates with dual systems. There is an elected president alongside the supreme leader. Secular government officials coexist with religious system officials. Conventional military forces stand alongside the Revolutionary Guards. Local governments function alongside local militia organizations. Therefore, while Iran's current situation appears turbulent on the surface, overthrowing Khomeini alone will not resolve all problems. Today's Iran features multiple significant interest groups that collectively form the nation's power network. First is Supreme Leader Khomeini and his inner circle, representing the core of power. Second is the security apparatus centered on the Revolutionary Guards and intelligence agencies, which operate their own industries and exemplify military business ventures. Third, the elected president, secular government, and state bureaucracy, responsible for daily governance including public welfare, budgeting, and international negotiations, though lacking final say on major national policies. Fourth, the clerical establishment. Many mistakenly assume clerics are subordinate to the supreme leader, but in reality, these state-salaried clerics constitute a co-opted group. though operating under religious banners. They are essentially civil servants whose legitimacy derives from the theocratic system rather than the elected government. Fifth is the grassroots religious network. Religious figures outside the state apparatus do not necessarily fully endorse Khomeini's leadership, as his theological credentials are not particularly distinguished. Rooted in local communities and directly engaging with the populace, these figures wield significant social influence. Sixth are the grassroots Basij militia, a volunteer force subordinate to the Revolutionary Guards. Rooted in local communities, they function as both intelligence networks and local power brokers. Seventh are various foundations serving influential figures, lacking formal public authority but wielding power derived from the interest groups they represent. This intricate web of interests reveals that Iran is not governed by a single ruling faction suppressing society, but rather by multiple groups forming alliances within the same national framework while simultaneously guarding against one another. Why has such a situation emerged in a country with limited resources, burdened by so many interest groups and a power structure built upon layers upon layers? The answer lies in historical roots, with the core reason being that the main force behind Iran's Islamic Revolution was not a religious group, yet they ultimately usurped the fruits of the revolution. When discussing Iran's theocracy, one must mention Khomeini and the 1979 Islamic Revolution that overthrew the Pahlavi dynasty. Many mistakenly believe this revolution was initiated by Islam, but that is not the case. During the Pahlavi era, societal corruption was rampant. A tiny elite lived in opulence while the masses languished in poverty, creating intensely sharp social tensions. As a leading Shiite Islamic theologian, Khomeini was among the first to openly criticize the Pahlavi regime, a stance that forced him into exile. After the revolution, Khomeini returned from exile. Capitalizing on the chaotic power vacuum among the various factions and leveraging his long-established prestige, he successfully usurped the fruits of the revolution. He allied with religious factions, employing a strategy of using the left to attack the right and the right to attack the left to systematically eliminate dissenters. At this juncture, the Americans presented Khomeini with a gift. They granted asylum to the exiled Shah. This act sparked intense fury among Iranian students, who stormed the U.S. embassy and took hostages. This incident directly led to the U.S. imposing long-term sanctions on Iran, sanctions that persist to this day. Amid this united anti-American sentiment, Khomeini further consolidated power. By 1980, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein launched a war against Iran. This conflict produced three critical outcomes. First, by leading the national resistance, Khomeini established absolute leadership authority while using the war as justification to ruthlessly eliminate domestic opposition forces. Second, to manage the war effort, Khomeini could not dismantle the old power structure entirely and instead chose to collaborate with it, preserving some elements of the old system. Third, to build a force entirely loyal to himself outside the old system, Khomeini established the Revolutionary Guard Corps. It was through this series of maneuvers that Iran's theocratic system was ultimately established. Following Khomeini's death, Ayatollah Khomeini assumed power and further expanded the scope of the ruling interest group. While Iran nominally operates under a theocratic system where the supreme leader is theoretically expected to be a master of theology, Khomeini's theological achievements were unremarkable. His true expertise lay in the art of power, the manipulation of political machinery. To consolidate his position, Khomeini ceded substantial privileges to the clerical establishment, empowering them to conduct a cult of personality campaign around him. These clerics were gradually co-opted by Khomeini using state resources, becoming a crucial pillar supporting his rule. The advantage of this power structure lies in the fact that the personal survival of the supreme leader does not directly threaten the stability of the entire social structure. With numerous interest groups sufficiently entrenched, replacing a single leader rarely alters the overall power dynamics. However, the drawbacks are equally evident. Excessive interest groups severely impede normal economic development, fostering a proliferation of privileged classes that siphon off vast amounts of social resources. Iran's inherently poor natural endowments, compounded by prolonged U.S. sanctions, mean its abundant oil reserves cannot directly resolve livelihood issues. The national economic pie remains small, while the number of those dividing it grows ever larger. Ordinary citizens' living space is constantly squeezed, inevitably deepening resentment. Thus, the frequent protests we witness in Iran are hardly novel. What distinguishes this moment is Iran's mounting demographic pressure. Persistently low international oil prices eroding state revenues, and increasingly brazen U.S. plundering on the global stage. Now even the privileged classes sense the pie is shrinking, further complicating and destabilizing the situation. Having discussed Iran's power structure, let's turn to Khomeini himself. He can be described as a power beast, a quintessential Machiavellian. Within the theocratic system, he even lacks sufficient theological credentials, yet through masterful political maneuvering, he has long dominated the apex of Iran's various power factions. Following the 2023 outbreak of the Israel-Palestine war, many pinned hopes on Iran leading the axis of resistance to deliver a crushing blow against Israel. Iran's performance, however, proved disappointing. Many turned from admiration to resentment, labeling Khomeini utterly incompetent and even wishing for his downfall. Yet we must recognize that displaying weakness against a powerful external enemy does not directly signal a leader's imminent collapse. Foreign powers seeking to overthrow a nation's leader typically employ a few methods: assassination, invasion, or inciting civil war. Beyond these, if a leader rules domestically with an iron fist and successfully appeases various interest groups, foreign forces have few effective means to topple him. Compared to addressing external threats, Khomeini has devoted more energy to navigating relations among Iran's numerous domestic factions. He never readily admits mistakes or shows weakness. For instance, he never publicly acknowledges policy errors. If issues arise, he quietly adjusts course. The most telling example is Iran's now relaxed enforcement of women's headscarf requirements. He pays little heed to public criticism, prioritizing instead the support of the Revolutionary Guards, the military, and his inner circle. Khomeini habitually operates behind the scenes of the elected government, allowing it to manage daily social conflicts and public pressure. Only when situations threaten to spiral out of control does he deploy the Revolutionary Guards to restore order, always ready to eliminate potential rivals. He also frequently exploits external forces targeting Iran to suppress domestic opposition. For instance, whenever Iran attempts to open up internationally or engage with the outside world, any setback becomes Khomeini's justification for cracking down on pro-American and liberal factions within the country. Indeed, since 2020 when Trump ordered the assassination of Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani, the US and Israel have systematically targeted and eliminated conservative figures within Iran's leadership. The successive deaths of former President Raisi and multiple IRGC commanders have left few staunch conservatives or resolute anti-American factions remaining in Iran's current leadership. Among potential successors, whether driven by self-interest, fear of US-Israeli retaliation, inherent pro-American leanings, or loss of faith in the current regime, none are unwaveringly anti-American. Therefore, from a cost perspective, if the US and Israel genuinely seek to overthrow Iran's current regime, the most prudent approach is to wait. Ayatollah Khomeini is currently in poor health. Simply waiting for his passing and allowing the succession team to take power would suffice. But let us not delude ourselves into expecting Iran to become a nation led by liberals as a result. The Middle East, particularly Iran, is shaped by geography, geopolitics, and complex domestic interests that necessitate strongman rule. Even if the theocracy ends, the most likely outcome is a military government. Finally, let's discuss the lessons from Iran's situation. Online debates often ask, is Iran's current predicament due to theocracy? Undeniably, from our perspective and standards, theocratic governance appears outdated and significantly inflates Iran's administrative costs. Within Iran's power structure, each system holds veto power and self-preservation instincts. The same pie must feed more interest groups, keeping society perpetually tense. Any relaxation of control threatens the theocratic system itself. Many demands for basic livelihood that seem perfectly reasonable to us become virtually non-negotiable once they cross the theocratic regime's red lines, forcing constant escalation. This has increasingly turned Iran into a high-cost stability maintenance enterprise. Yet we must clearly recognize that Iran's structural contradictions stem more from geographical resource scarcity, sustained pressure from international sanctions, and a severe security environment. Even without the theocratic layer, Iran would still grapple with these fundamental constraints. The Middle East is not devoid of secular regimes. Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Bashar al-Assad in Syria were both highly secular leaders. Yet secularism did not liberate the region's people. Basic resources like water, food, and arable land exert far greater political influence than religious beliefs. We can further reflect that even for a resource-rich nation, any regime must maintain a delicate equilibrium among three pillars: economic development, social stability, and the support of interest groups. Imbalance in any one of these will undermine the nation's stable progress. Today's Iran and today's United States actually face the same problem. National economic growth is slowing down. The public share of the nation's development dividends is shrinking, while the demands of interest groups are growing ever more numerous and assertive. Consequently, public discontent continues to accumulate. In short, governance costs are rising while social benefits diminish. Both nations have effectively entered a state of cold civil war. Beyond their substantial reserves and resilience to turmoil, today's chaotic United States structurally faces identical predicaments to Iran. For many Chinese, there was an initial fantasy that Iran would serve as China's key ally in West Asia, a tough guy capable of striking back against the United States and Israel. Iran's past ability to actively project influence in regional affairs stemmed largely from its relatively robust fiscal capacity at the time. However, with the continuous decline in international oil prices and the intensification of domestic conflicts, Iran's capacity for external influence has noticeably diminished. Faced with relentless pressure from major powers, many feel anxious, especially after Trump kidnapped Maduro, urging China to step in immediately. Here, we can draw an analogy from the late Eastern Han Dynasty. Some preferred strategic foresight, like Yuan Shao and He Jin. Others rush to achieve results like Deng Zhuo. And some appear powerful, like Yuan Shao during the warlord era, yet all ultimately faltered in the first wave of turmoil. The defining feature of today's world is chaos, and we are still in its early stages. No one can accurately predict its trajectory. External forces excel not at direct subversion, but at inducing mistakes born of anxiety. The more you act, the greater your chances of error. Against this backdrop, the most prudent policy is often to first stabilize internal order and secure resources, build high walls and stockpile grain, maintaining composure amid chaos. To summarize, when assessing a nation's crisis, first examine its governance costs. When analyzing political upheaval, first observe the dynamics among interest groups. And when evaluating international competition, scrutinize a nation's internal environment. No breaking news emerges suddenly. All carry deep-rooted causal logic. Whether Iran will undergo regime change may require time to answer, but we can be certain this nation, profoundly shaped by geography and history, will continue along the trajectory of strongman rule. In this complex and ever-changing world, we must transcend emotional biases, discern the underlying logic behind events, and embrace the future with greater rationality and optimism. If you have differing perspectives on Iran's situation, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. We also encourage you to like and follow us as we explore the truth of this world together.